Joining us now from across the pond to talk climate change, George Monbiot, the author of Heat, How to Stop the Planet from Burning. Welcome to Toronto.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to have you here. I want to start by going through this, just for our viewers who may not have been up on this, the email scandal that is going on right now. I'll read a little excerpt from The Guardian and then we'll chat about this. Thousands of documents taken from computers at the University of East Anglia also suggested that academics on both sides of the Atlantic discussed deleting sensitive emails to evade freedom of information requests from climate change skeptics. In one email, Professor Phil Jones, the director of the university's climatic research unit, referred to a, quote, trick he applied to raw data to hide the decline in global temperatures. More than 4,000 emails and documents taken from computer servers at UEA by a hacker were posted online. Climate change skeptics claim that they provided evidence of an international conspiracy to blame global warming on human activity. Okay, what's your reaction to all that, George?
Well, it's going to be some time before we know what it all means, and the great majority of those emails don't seem to contain anything incriminating, but there are one or two which are worrying, and I believe there should be no secrecy in science. I think secrecy is the enemy of science, and I want to see all the data released. I want to see a proper inquiry to take place into this, and if, as it seems, people have behaved in a secretive way, well, that's most regrettable, and that's something which should be discouraged. However, what it does not do, though some people have claimed it does, is to ensure that the whole global warming thing is a scam and that climate change isn't happening and all the rest of it. They've been blown out of all proportion in terms of the importance that they have as far as climate change is concerned. Now, what didn't happen when those emails were released is that the world's glaciers stopped retreating and the world's sea ice stopped melting and the world's temperatures stopped rising.
I hear you, and we will get to that, but the skeptics say this is proof that the scientists are manipulating data for their own purposes. Are they right about that?
It might be proof that 3 or 4 scientists out of tens of thousands might have messed possibly with 1 or 2 lines of evidence. It's not clear even that that's the case, but there are hundreds and hundreds of lines of evidence that show us that man-made climate change is taking place. Even if you were to exclude every single thing that those scientists were talking about in those emails, it wouldn't make a jot of difference to the overall picture that the world is warming up because of our greenhouse gas emissions.
Should we be less sure today than we were, say, before all this broke, that their science is accurate and unbiased?
Well, I am concerned about a couple of these emails, and I think they might show evidence of bias on those particular lines of evidence. And and this is just some particular data sets, but it doesn't tell us anything about the overall science of climate change.
You don't think it affects the theory at all?
Oh, no, because there are so many lines of evidence all pointing in the same direction. It's not as if there's some overarching evil genius who's got some great scheme to say we're going to create this wholly fake canon of science. I mean, this has been building up, this canon of science, since the 1820s. And there are tens of thousands of scientific papers and lots of different kinds of evidence showing us what's going on. Apart from anything else, there's the simple temperature record taken by thermometers around the world since 1850, which show this steady rising temperature where there's been major impacts on the world's ecosystems, on the glaciers, on the snowfields, on the ice packs, on the ice caps.
But you know
on
that the skeptics say
animals.
We're not supposed to measure this over 150 years, we're supposed to measure this over thousands of years, and therefore whatever's happening over 150 years shouldn't be, should not affect our behavior all that much. To which you'd say what?
Well, I think that's an extraordinary argument because it's already affecting our lives. If you go to the north of Canada, you can see the impact that it's having. But even more importantly, in Africa, for example, there are many parts of that continent where the temperatures have increased to the extent that it's drying out and the rain isn't coming. There have been some very severe droughts recently in the Sahel region and in the Horn of Africa, which are having huge impacts on people's lives. Now, what the temperature's doing in 2,000 years' time, I'm less concerned about.
You're more
what the
concerned about
temperature's
today.
going to be doing today
Okay.
and over the next century, this is something we should all be worried about.
We do know when we read, and of course we read in your dispatches as well, that there is a tremendous consensus today in the scientific community as to why climate change is happening. Do you think that that consensus has been manufactured, in inverted commas?
No, I mean, that would require a tremendous global conspiracy, a conspiracy involving not just all the world's climate scientists, but all the world's physical scientists, everyone involved in physics and chemistry, because they would all have to be party to this grand scam. Otherwise, they would be saying, well, it just defies all the laws of physics to be saying that man-made climate change is happening. In fact, it's supported by all the laws of physics. You can demonstrate it in the laboratory. But involved in that grand conspiracy, you'd also have to have most of the world's governments. You would have to have the world's environment agencies. You'd have to have staggering numbers of people involved.
Or a few people with emails saying, this evidence I have here is not consistent with what we're all saying, so let's just not put that out there. I mean, that's what they did, didn't they?
Oh, listen, there are 3 or 4 people who wrote those emails whose behavior, if the emails can be taken at face value, I deplore. I don't support some of the sentiments expressed in those emails, and I don't support some of the secrecy that was taking place. But I say again, these are 3 or 4 out of tens of thousands of people involved in these sciences. And these are 1 or 2 lines of evidence out of hundreds of lines of evidence. They do not affect the overall picture.
Okay, Michael Griffin is the former administrator at NASA, and he was at a Quantum to Cosmos festival that we all attended here at TVO last month in Waterloo. And he said the scientific method is a systemization of a way of thinking combined with the value of openness and dialogue. And he went on to say, anytime I hear someone say, quote, scientific consensus, the alarm bells start going off, because if it's consensus, it isn't science. Is he right about that?
Well, what I would ask him is, then what do you think of the scientific consensus that HIV causes AIDS, or that smoking causes lung cancer? There's a consensus on both of those issues. Does it mean it's not science?
Period, full stop. In other words, he's wrong.
Yes, of course. There are some areas where the science is so firm that of course there's a consensus. There's a scientific consensus that 1 + 1 = 2. That doesn't mean it ceases to be science. It just means the evidence is very strong.
Does it also mean, though, that if somebody were to come forward with a competing or contradictory theory, they'd get laughed out of the building, and that wouldn't serve anybody's interests either?
If someone were able to demonstrate that man-made climate change isn't taking place, and able to demonstrate it to the standards required to be accepted by science, which in other words means demonstrable evidence, they would win the Nobel Prize. The opportunities are fantastic. If somebody's got this evidence, please come forward. I would be the first to cheer and throw my hat in the air if it turned out to be true. But what happens in science is that the scientists are extremely competitive. They desperately want to be the one who cracked the grand theory. So if anyone were able to do that, and if anyone were able to produce compelling evidence showing that man-made climate change is a fraud and a scam and all of these things that we're told, then they would be perhaps the most famous scientist on Earth.
But I think that's their point, is that the fear of coming forward with that contradictory
fear of
type
winning the Nobel Prize is a terrifying prospect, I have to say.
It wouldn't be the fear, no, because Gore's got the Nobel Prize, so anybody wants to come forward and attack
but not
Al
for
Gore.
science. He didn't get a science Nobel Prize, he got the Nobel Prize for Peace, didn't he?
But you know what I'm getting at here. If you tried to come forward now with a theory that said all of what we've said about climate change is wrong, and I have the new evidence here that suggests it, the danger is that he'd be laughed out of the building before he had a chance to have his information or her information taken seriously. That's the concern.
Well, I mean, I notice, as someone who writes articles and gets lots of people commenting, that people are so terrified of saying that climate change is a con and a scam that they have to say it about 1,000 times a day on the end of my articles in the comment threads. Look, who's intimidating people here? Where is this great fear coming from? And where's the evidence that anyone is frightened of speaking their mind on this? That far from being frightened, they're happy to jump all over anybody who says that climate change is taking place. And the people who are being bullied here are the climate scientists.
In which case, what about climate change, in your view, is still open to debate?
The extent of it, whether we're going to get in this century 2 degrees of warming, which is about the minimum possible, or 6 degrees of warming, which is about the maximum possible. We can't be sure of that because there's lots of different variables. The total impacts that it's going to have, is this going to mean depriving 1.5 billion people of water supplies or 3 billion people of water supplies? Again, that's something we can't be sure of. It's the details of what climate change will do that are still to be discussed and still to be debated, and there's a great deal of work left to be done. And of course the trouble is you can't see into the future. And people say, oh, look at these models, you can't rely on these models. I say, well, what would you prefer? Tea leaves, crystal balls, entrails? What are we going to do? We have to have some way of getting some handle on what might happen this century. And of course we cannot be sure because we don't have time machines. If someone invented a time machine, that would be a fantastic way of finding out what's going to happen between now and 2100. But in the absence of time machines, we have to just use the best available data and the best available tools for interpreting that data to give us an informed guess about what might happen.
Well, let me get your best informed guess, not about what's going to happen 90 years from now, but how about next month? Namely, what do you want them to do at Copenhagen?
Well, good. I thought for a horrible moment you're going to ask me about the weather next month.
You're good, but you're not that good.
What we desperately need to see is a legally binding agreement at Copenhagen, so that countries all state these are going to be our targets, we're going to stick to these targets between the years 2012 and 2020, this is what our program's going to be. Unfortunately, that now seems extremely unlikely, and of course they're managing our expectations downwards to say the best we can have is an outline agreement which will later turn into a proper full treaty agreement maybe next year. The trouble is, the timetable is very tight because the current climate change treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, that runs out at the end of 2012, and it took 8 years to implement that treaty because it was agreed in '97, it didn't come into force till 2008.
The one no one's following.
The one no one's following. And now we've got 3 years to implement a new treaty, even if there were to be a legally binding agreement this year, which isn't going to happen. So the timetable is getting so tight that it's looking very difficult to see how it could actually be done.
Are you open to a different standard of reduction from the developing world to the developed world?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be the only fair way to do it. If you look at Canada, for instance, Canada has roughly 6 times, between 5 and 6 times, the amount of carbon production per person as China does. So for the Canadians, who, it has to be said, are being the big problem when it comes to Copenhagen, and the Canadian government's causing more trouble than any other government on earth, for the Canadian government to turn around and say, it's not our fault, it's those Chinese, that is really unfair. It's emissions per person, which is what counts.
We're energy pigs. I think we know it too. We've been told it often enough.
Well, I mean...
It gets cold here in the wintertime,
Sure,
and hot in the summer.
Well, if you look at Norway, though, Norway has got 1/3 of the emissions per person as you have, and Norway is a very cold country which depends on oil for much of its economy. So you can do a lot better than this. Now, I don't blame the ordinary Canadians. I mean, the great majority of Canadians I've met are extremely nice and friendly people. But the government at the moment is dragging this country's name through the mud. I mean, the impression it's creating on the world stage is a really, really bad one. I mean, it was so bad that at the talks in October in Bangkok, most of the developing world countries walked out while the Canadian delegate was speaking because they felt they were being bullied by Canada. And that's, Canada's had a reputation of being the world's peacekeeper, as being this really responsible, friendly nation. And that reputation's getting squandered at the moment.
Well, except that the last guy who ran on a carbon tax on a quote-unquote responsible environmental platform got slaughtered in the last election. So that there's a lesson there for politicians in this country. It's not the lesson you want them to come to, but they would argue there is.
There are lots of reasons why people get slaughtered in elections.
That is true, and that was only one of them. That is true. You're in town, actually, because you're attending the Monk debate tomorrow, and one of the guys you're going to be challenged by, I guess, is Bjorn Lomborg, who we've had on this program as well, who says that we ought to be spending a lot more on technological solutions to problems rather than trying to cut back on our CO2 emissions, which he believes will be next to impossible. Why is he wrong about that approach?
Well, all the figures show that trying to adapt to climate change costs a heck of a lot more than trying to prevent climate change from happening in the first place. And the horrible truth is that while in the rich nations we probably could afford that, just about, we probably could afford it, in the poor nations people won't be able to afford it. It just will not be plausible for them. And overwhelmingly, this is a moral issue, really, because in a country like Canada, most of whom live in the fairly temperate parts of Canada, you can cope with a few degrees of warming. It's not going to be the end of the world for you. There's climatic resilience here. But in a place like Ethiopia, a place like Sudan, a place like Malawi, people can't cope with that. A few degrees of warming tips them over the edge. And yet they're not the ones responsible for it. They haven't been producing huge amounts of carbon, hardly any at all. And while we're the ones responsible, they're the ones who have to pick up the bill. And so we have a moral obligation to act on this, and to say, oh, we can deal with it when it comes sometime in the future, that doesn't answer the case at all.
I got a number of emails from people today who, when they heard you were going to be on, said, you must ask him this question. So this is for them. Ask him how he got here. Ask him whether he practices what he preaches. Did he fly a plane to get over here? My hunch is you did. Do you drive a car back in the UK? My hunch is you do. I don't know. You want to speak to all of that stuff?
Well, of course, I took my kayak.
You kayaked across the Atlantic, okay.
No, look, I 2 years ago, actually, I'd said to myself, I'm not going to fly again. And I managed to stick with this until these darn pesky Canadians pestered me so much to come over here and to weigh into this fight, because they perceive, as many people around the world do, that Canada is now the big sticking point for Copenhagen, that eventually it was easier to give in than to stick with it. And yeah, I feel bad about flying. I don't want to do it because it does have these big environmental implications. But in this case, I was persuaded that I could potentially do more good than harm and make up for the carbon emissions that I'm producing by joining the campaign in Canada to plead with the government to change its approach to these climate change talks. Because at the moment, Canada is the big sticking point. And it's amazing to say this. I found myself finishing my article today that I was writing for The Guardian, and I'm saying, who's the big problem here? Who's threatening world peace and prosperity? Is it Saudi Arabia? No. Is it Iran? No. Is it China? No. Is it North Korea? No. It's Canada. Canada? How can it be Canada? It seems so implausible. It's this lovely nation full of amazing people which has been so responsible for a century. And now, in a couple of weeks, it could do as much harm that would cancel out all the good that this amazing country has done in a century.
I think people here would love to think that we are that significant a player on the international
stage. In the Copenhagen talks, you are.
Over China, over the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. Because China and the United States have both, they've caused some difficulties, but they've both been driving the process forward in the way that they want, not necessarily the way that everyone else would want, but they've been driving it forward. Whereas Canada has systematically tried to sabotage these talks, and at every opportunity, it's thrown a spanner in the works to try and stop an agreement from going ahead. And it is quite a powerful nation in these talks, because it's a member of the G8, member of the Commonwealth, and a member of the Kyoto group of industrialized countries, and that puts it in a very good position for throwing a spanner in the works.
George, it's great of you to spend some time with us here at TVO tonight. Good luck with your Monk debate tomorrow, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much.